Well, the people who really held power by 1714 were the wealthy elite. There had been a shift in power away from the monarchy towards Parliament, which meant that Welsh MPs had much more influence than in previous centuries. There were 27 members of Parliament representing Wales, and they came from a small group of wealthy landowning families in each county, often referred to as the gentry. So what we see is a system which some historians have referred to as a period of almost home rule, because it was the leaders of Welsh society, the landowners, who were taking on the day-to-day responsibility for governing the country on behalf of the government in Westminster. And these were the people who represented the country as MPs and also acted in each county as Justices of Peace, or JPs. And this was a period when a great deal of power was delegated to the county level. And that meant the role of the JP was absolutely fundamental, not just in terms of law and justice, but also for government and administration. They ran the counties on behalf of central government, with very little supervision from London, which was in practical terms, of course, some distance away for any real oversight of what was happening. So effectively around 10 Justices of Peace in each county, in each of the 13 counties at the time, operated the machinery of government and maintained law and order. By 1714, Wales had officially been part of the Kingdom of England for nearly 200 years, since the so-called Acts of Union in the 16th century. That meant that when the Act of Union between England and Scotland was passed in 1707, Wales was swept along as part of the Kingdom of England and therefore became part of the new state, the new United Kingdom of Great Britain. Although there was a long-standing political and legal union with England, there were still real differences when it came to language and culture, all of which held preserved a separate sense of Welsh identity. And by this point, rebellion against English rule was a thing of the past. A large part of the reason for that has been identified as the sense of a special relationship with the Crown, which had developed under the Tudor monarchy, a family with Welsh roots, of course. That legacy of loyalty had been inherited by the Stuarts, so the Welsh have generally been portrayed as staunchly royalist in the 17th century, and they really did continue to be so. Very few people had the vote in this period, so most had no way of expressing their opinions about the way they were governed. There were, of course, a number of riots and protests, but they're usually seen as more of a response to social and economic problems than any real opposition to the system of government by England. So, with George I inheriting the throne in 1714 and establishing the Hanoverian dynasty, the royal family's Welsh blood was running thin. But the tradition of loyalty was well established by then. There was, of course, another partner in the mix, with Scotland becoming part of the Union. And each country is seen as managing to maintain a separate sense of identity, but at the same time, what might be considered British institutions and elements of a new British identity were being created, including the Union flag, with the Cross of St George for England and the Cross of St Andrew for Scotland. Wales, as part of the Kingdom of England, was not represented separately on the flag, and that to a large extent perhaps sums up its status in the new political union. It has been suggested by historians, Linda Colley in particular, that what the different nations of the United Kingdom in the 18th century had in common above all else was Protestantism. In fact, Wales, Scotland and England all developed their own preferred brands of Protestantism, so they weren't completely united even in that. But perhaps what they did have in common was a certain opposition to Catholicism. This was a period which experienced several very important developments in terms of society, the economy, education and religion. And that's why it's been argued that this period saw the laying of the foundations of what would become modern Wales. So it is key to understanding how Wales developed in the way it did in the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the important changes was the more rapid growth in population in the second half of the century, part of a trend across Europe in this period. And population rose to around 500,000 by the end of the century. So it was still a thinly populated country, made up of scattered rural communities with very few large towns. But there was an increasing of pressure on resources as the population grew, with more demand for more agricultural land to sustain the population, leading to enclosure of wasteland and commons, and a lot of ill feeling, of course, in response to that, as people felt that they were being stripped of some of their traditional rights. It was still a poor country, but there were some important developments in the second half of the century relating to industry. And of course, we tend to think a lot about the South Wales valleys in this context, but some of the early developments actually took place in the northeast, around the Wrexham area. And the Industrial Revolution in Wales was very much based on heavy industry, especially the iron industry in the early period. And the money for that came from the outside. It's often been said that industrialisation was something that was done to Wales, but it was Welsh people who supplied the workforce in the early stages. Rich industrialists leased the land and invested in the mineral resources that were found under the ground. And the main focus became the South Wales coalfield, where iron ore and coal were found in very close proximity to each other, and also to water, which was needed for the processes, and also to transport the products of the ironworks down to docks in ports like Cardiff, which developed substantially during this period. And workers often moved to the industrial areas for a short period, sometimes just over winter, in order to make money to take back to their families in rural Wales. That meant that this was a very fluid and unsettled community, often described as a frontier society. And although there were very considerable developments by 1785, industry would continue to grow substantially afterwards and would transform the Welsh landscape, economy and society. So it was a major change to a country that had been so reliant on agriculture for centuries. One of the other significant developments was the growth of literacy and print culture. The first printed book had appeared in Welsh in 1546, and because of government censorship and licensing laws, printing presses could only be established in London, Oxford and Cambridge. And that made printing in Welsh very difficult. It was in 1695 that the law changed, and in 1718 that the first printing press was set up in Wales itself. And that was the start of the transformation. And by 1785 there was a thriving professional printing industry in Wales, centred on towns like Carmarthen, and that made it much easier and cheaper to publish and distribute Welsh books. There was also a growing market for Welsh books as a result of the growth of literacy, and this is one of the most remarkable developments in this period, in a country with no universities and no tradition of formal education in Welsh. There were grammar schools for the sons of the well-off members of society, but they didn't teach in Welsh, which was the only language of the vast majority of the population. So the real breakthrough came with the charity schools in the 18th century, relying on contributions from generous benefactors. And one of the main innovators was Griffith Jones, a clergyman based in Llanddowror in Carmarthenshire. And he was worried that people were living and dying without really understanding the Protestant faith because they couldn't read the Bible for themselves. And this prompted him to set up the scheme known as the circulating schools, beginning in his own parish in the early 1730s and spreading to just about every county in Wales over the next 30 years. School teachers were sent out to parishes where they spent 3 months, focusing just on teaching pupils of all ages to read. And crucially, in order to be as effective as possible, as quickly as possible, the decision was made to teach through the first language of the pupils, which meant Welsh in most areas of Wales. And that hadn't been done systematically by any schools before this. So during Griffith Jones's lifetime, by the time of his death in 1761, at least 200,000 pupils had been taught, at a time when the population was around 490,000. That means we're talking about nearly half of the population, and that's a conservative estimate. So this of course created a market for published Welsh books, so the schools and the growing print industry fed each other in effect. The growth in literacy is often linked to the emergence of the evangelical revival in Wales, often referred to as the Methodist revival, and this had a major impact on the country, much more so than on England. It led to the creation of new Protestant denominations by the early 19th century, Calvinistic Methodists and the Wesleyan Methodists. But it also breathed new life into existing nonconformist groups, the Baptists and the Independents, who had been a very small minority in 1714, perhaps forming around 5% of the population. By 1785, this had changed, and there were more alternatives to the Anglican parish church, and most of them used Welsh as the language of worship, as a natural choice. So religion was one of the key elements sustaining the Welsh language. English had been declared the official language of law and government in the 16th century, but Elizabeth I had also ordered the translation of the Bible and prayer book into Welsh, so that Welsh had an official status as the language of public worship in parish churches, and that gave the Welsh language a significant role in relation to religion, and that connection would continue to be important. There hasn't been much discussion of Welsh involvement in the expansion of the early British Empire. The overwhelming majority of Welsh people had no knowledge of any language other than Welsh, and were in no position to play much of a role as a result. But there is reason to suppose that they were broadly supportive. There were some individuals who did get involved, sometimes in rather questionable ways, including in the slave trade. And there were individuals who made a good deal of money working with the East India Company, and were then able to buy landed estates in Wales as a result. Perhaps the most significant connection was through the iron industry, which was becoming increasingly important for the army and navy. It was actually quite wise to have an internal source of iron, particularly in times of war, rather than importing from countries that might end up on the other side of the fight. So that meant that Welsh iron became really important for the expansion of the empire. During wars as well, some Welshmen would be prepared to go and fight under the British flag, at times motivated by a sense that they were defending the Protestant religion against Catholic countries like France. So religion and war both played a part in encouraging a sense of loyalty to Britain and its empire, and Wales proved useful to the empire because of the resources it had to offer in terms of iron and also in terms of men to fight. Wales in 1785 was significantly different to Wales in 1714. One of the key aspects which has often been highlighted is the shift in population. Whereas the population had been fairly evenly distributed between the 13 counties which made up Wales, there was a greater concentration developing in the southeast, in Glamorgan and Monmouthshire, because larger numbers were drawn to the higher wages in the ironworks. And in the early stages of industrialisation, most of the workers came from areas within Wales, so these were still largely Welsh-speaking communities. And the concentration of population made it easier to spread new ideas and also to incite protest, so these communities were frequently viewed as potentially problematic by the authorities. Economic difficulties could certainly turn them into powder kegs ready to ignite into riot. Another really important change was the increase in terms of literacy, with rates higher than in many countries in Europe at this point. And of course, the aim had initially been to teach people to read the Bible, but once they were able to read, there was no real way of limiting what else they might read. So improving religious knowledge opened up the prospect of greater access to current affairs and political writing. And the growth in literacy certainly had an impact in terms of religion. Historians like Glanmor Williams have suggested that the Protestant Reformation came of age in the 18th century because this was when large sections of the population learned to read the Bible and make much more informed choices about religion. More and more they were choosing to turn away from the established Anglican Church, the Church of England that was linked to the state, and were joining nonconformist groups, which would become even more popular in the 19th century. And since nonconformists felt under a disadvantage compared to Anglicans, for example because the law didn't allow them to attend university, they had cause to campaign for political reform, which would be a significant factor in years to come. There were elements of continuity. There was still a large gulf between rich and poor, but in between those two, the middling sorts have been identified as an increasingly influential group, a little bit better off, with aspirations to become better educated and better informed. They were beginning to emerge as potential leaders in terms of culture, religion and politics. And Wales was poised on the brink of a cultural revival, but also poised for a greater interest in discussion of political ideas. The tradition of expressing displeasure through collective riot was seen throughout the 18th century, often relating to food shortages, but it is considered to have started to take on rather more of a political nature by the end of the century and into the disturbances of the early 19th century. So there are a number of really important developments in this period which help lay the foundations of modern Wales and helps explain how Wales would develop into the 19th and 20th century as a more nonconformist, politically radical country than it had been.